to receive outside funds. That's fine, thanks. No, for other products I got. Okay. I want to allocate some salary to a certain fundraiser, which I'm free to get. I don't know if you actually receive the money or not.
So what you have to do is follow up with whoever's done. It's not actually not required. I do it.
Welcome to the Rational Middle Energy Series Google Hangout. We are going to be launching our Canadian episodes today, and I cannot tell you how excited I am to be speaking to who we're going to be speaking to. I want to take everyone a little bit through what the Rational Middle is, introduce our panelists, and then we're going to see Canada's Way Forward, which is a film that we did about Canadian energy policy. What's interesting about what we've done here is actually some of the experts that are in the film are some of the ones that we are actually going to be talking to online today. I also want to apologize for the frame rate. Google has not played nice with us on the last couple that we've done. We will be seeing the film, but you'll see it kind of staccato. I will tell you that if you'd like to see any of the films that we're putting out, you could just go to rationalmiddle.com. That especially goes for Canada's Way Forward. And again, we're very excited. I want to start by just saying a little bit about what the Rational Middle is. I mean, the Rational Middle is a series that was created. It's free to download. It's free to absorb and utilize how you want to utilize it. The main thrust behind it is to give sort of balanced information about one of the most important issues that's out there, which is energy. What we've done with this is not only create these films, but we started to do these events pretty much all over North America, and we're very excited to be doing it. Today, I'm especially excited because we have some incredible panelists that are going to be not only with us before the film, but also here with us after the film and able to answer your questions. So be sure to get your questions in via Twitter, and you can tag it Rational Middle, or also you can also message us through Facebook, and we can actually take questions that way too. Again, I'm extremely excited. I'm going to let these guys introduce themselves, but just an overview of who they are. It's Kaylee Taylor, Tyler Bryant, and Richard Adamson, who all have contributed greatly to what the Rational is and what it's become. I tell you, why don't we start with you, Kaylee, and let you kind of talk a little bit about your organization, who you are, what you do, and how you find yourself to be sitting here with us today.
Sure, sounds great. Thanks, Gregory. My name is Kaylee Taylor. I'm the executive director of an organization called Student Energy, and we're focused on educating and empowering the next generation of energy leaders who are committed to transitioning the world to a sustainable future. So Gregory and I were connected through someone on his advisory board, actually, and we're both in the business of middle, rational, balanced conversations. And so that's how we came to get connected.
And and I do want to say, Kaylee just sort of gave sort of a broad overview of who she is and what she does, but she does amazing work in the sense that she has really tapped into the youth that will be coming up to actually help create that energy future, and it's an amazing organization, and she's an amazing spirit. Another one from the films. Why don't we go to you next, Richard? And you can introduce yourself.
I'm Richard Adamson. I'm Managing Director of Carbon Management Canada. CMC is a national network and actually international network of researchers addressing the issue of industrial scale carbon emissions associated primarily with the energy sector. So we have folks working on a wide range of technology side issues, as well as policy and regulatory, social sciences, public engagement issues. So very broad based, addressing all dimensions of trying to address the industrial carbon emissions, greenhouse gases associated with the energy sector.
And it's funny, I was talking to Richard beforehand, and we were discussing this idea that I can always go to Richard with my most unbridled optimistic ideas, and Richard's always the one who puts that splash of reality, and so we look forward to having him on the panel and having you discuss some of these things you like to discuss on there. So very excited to have you. Tyler, why don't you talk a little bit about yourself and about the David Suzuki Foundation?
Sure. Well, I'll say cold hard reality is always the bane of doing ambitious carbon emissions reduction scenarios out in the future. But as a policy analyst here at David Suzuki Foundation, I'm basically developing those scenarios, so doing energy system modeling and policy design work with various industrial, commercial, and individual stakeholders to identify optimal solutions to reach 80% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2050, consistent with, as the IPCC says, a 2-degree warming or below a threshold of 2-degree warming. The David Suzuki Foundation is one of the largest environmental NGOs in Canada, and climate energy is one of our keen interests, and we like to broach a lot of stakeholders and really work to try and find solutions to what we conceive of as the greatest not only environmental challenge but socio-technical political challenge that human civilization has ever faced.
And I do want to say Tyler and I actually met on when he participated on our advisory panel. One of the things we like to do with the Rational Middle is to really kind of get those films out there, get the right heads in the room, and have them sort of assess what we've done. And Tyler was instrumental in helping us sort of make these films effective. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate not only Tyler being on the panel, but also I appreciate the fact that Tyler is in such good spirits after watching the Toronto Blue Jays go down and the Boston Red Sox take the World Series, bring it to the U.S., which is, yeah, I know. Tyler.
When I first started advising on what the videos, it was kind of the early days of the season, and there was a lot of optimism, and it's all gone now.
That's all right. That's right. It's hockey season. It's hockey season for you guys. So we're extremely excited for that new sort of birth of sports, which is the one that you guys usually win. Now what we're going to do is we're going to see the film again. I deeply apologize for the frame rate that you're about to see. If you see it at rationalmiddle.com, you will see it at its normal frame rate. But we're going to kind of struggle through this right now, and then we're going to come out on the other side and start this discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you all for being here. And Chris, if you could just roll the film. That's right. It's hockey season. It's hockey season for you guys. So we're extremely excited for that new sort of birth of sports.
The developing issue around energy is, can Canada actually create a coherent national energy strategy?
We've got to get rid of all the political agendas. Sit down and start to go back to basics and say, what do we have? What do we need to address? And start from principles to focus on what do we need to do as Canada.
Without getting into whose climate models you like and whose climate models you don't like, the general principle I have simplistically is We can't keep adding CO2 to the atmosphere and increasing that concentration indefinitely without consequence.
The issue of climate change is one that has been discussed pretty widely over the last 20 years, all through North America. And the response on the Canadian side has been a growing awareness that it's real and that at some point in the future it will have measurable impacts on their lifestyle and on their costs of living and on the cost of goods that they consume.
In terms of Canada's overall focus on reducing emissions, Canada, like the US, has signed up to a 17% reduction versus 2005 by 2020 in its carbon emissions. So it's made a commitment there. We can talk about, is that enough? But the fact of the matter is that there certainly has been a recognition that something needs to be done.
So because there's such diversity, the issues are quite unique in each province. And so oftentimes the challenge is how do you continue to keep the economy growing? How are you competitive on the world stage?
The thing that is a challenge for us is that because our single biggest consumer of our goods and services is the U.S., if we get out of step with the U.S., too far out of step, our commodities, our goods and services will price themselves out of the U.S. market.
So Canada also has to try and balance this sort of, this difficult situation of not wanting to leap too far ahead of the US because it doesn't want to be uncompetitive, but on the other hand, not being perceived as being a laggard either.
So I think that the question of whether or not Canada's energy future will be vibrant and bright is in many ways dependent on the collaborative relationships they set up with the U.S. and also to a certain extent the competitive relationships that they establish, for instance, in the Pacific Rim. One example of this is the issue of whether or not Canada could or should be able to get heavy oil products out. China has a tremendous demand for oil. They also have a tremendous demand for coal.
For us to ignore the fact that we're shipping our coal to countries and they're burning it in coal-fired plants, and we frown on that here, that's ridiculous. I don't think we should be burning coal anywhere.
The Canadian government has decided to take the approach around reducing emissions on a sector-by-sector basis. So already they have looked at the transportation sector, and their decision was, we're just going to harmonize our approach with the U.S. Because the vehicles that we produce in Canada are used in the U.S. and we buy vehicles from the U.S., it makes sense to harmonize. So we're going with the CAFE standards that the U.S. has set. On electricity, we have set new regulation for electricity generation. You won't be able to build a standard coal plant in the future in Canada. It'll have to include either new technology or carbon capture and storage in order to build a new coal plant.
Since all energy resources are pretty unique, we need some common denominator to be able to say what would be underneath an energy policy that unites all these disparate energy development and generation forms. And at the end of the day, I think that common element is a carbon equivalency. That is, that embedded in every energy use is a consumption of carbon issue or release of carbon waste products.
So in British Columbia, they have a carbon tax, $30 a ton currently. I think it's going to continue to increase, and it's applied equally to all fossil fuel combustion.
So consumers, the end users of carbon, are paying a few cents per liter on gasoline. And they've been raising that. And generally, British Columbians have been okay with that. We put up with all kinds of excise taxes on other things like alcohol or tobacco, and people generally accept them. Taxing carbon, I think people could get used to the idea. People then would change their behavior. They would find other alternative sources of transportation. They would walk more. They would carpool more. They would maybe take public transit more. They would make some changes so that they're not paying as much in transportation.
British Columbia has a carbon tax. Alberta has a carbon levy. And there's a slight distinction between the two. BC's applies across the board, and it goes into general revenue into the government.
In Alberta, as a different example, what they had decided to do is work with the large emitters, the industrial emitters. So if you're emitting over 100,000 tons, you have intensity targets that are set for you by the provincial government, and you have 3 ways of meeting that target. You can improve the energy efficiency within your own operation of that facility.
They can purchase offsets, or they can pay into a technology fund. It's a $15 per ton cost.
That fund is used to fund innovation around how do you solve the problem of carbon emissions. That's a really smart system because, first off, the levy creates an incentive to implement technology to address the carbon emissions issues, but the funds collected on the levy go into developing the technologies that might help solve the problem because we don't have them right now.
The problem is they're simply not working very well. Alberta is actually only on track to meet its climate target by about 1/3.
But I think Alberta did some really smart things around the way this regulation is set up. First off, the regulation is set up so that it's relatively unintrusive. So it allowed them to put the structure in place and gave them the controls without getting too much pushback because the thresholds were low enough that it wasn't too intrusive. And now they've got controls that they can start turning up as the political will to take action increases.
Right now, we're not maximizing our investments in the clean energy economy. We only are about 1% of the 1 trillion clean energy economy today. And we know that that clean energy market is likely to expand to $3 trillion by 2020. So there is significant growth in that economy, and we don't want Canada to be left behind.
Both for the United States and Mexico and Canada, it doesn't really make sense to keep using the word independence anymore. It makes a lot of sense to have a North American pattern of development, a North American pattern of investment, and along with that, North American stimulus for capital movement, and in fact lower barriers and common standards for using some of these products.
Even if those countries, Canada and the United States, have pulled out of Kyoto Accord, Canada's federal government, all 10 provincial governments, they would have an environmental policy. They'd be different in the spectrum of how intense they are, but all of them would say publicly, yeah, we need to reduce our carbon. Where they differ is on how and how quickly we need to do it.
I looked back at the Rio 1992 Canadian Outcomes Report, and the challenges that are listed in that outcome report are no timelines, no will, undermining the existence of anthropogenic climate change. It's 20 years later, and those are still the exact same barriers. The only difference is that Canada has now slid from trying to take a leadership role and encouraging those things to realizing that we have a massive potential market resource and realizing that the environment might not play as big a role as it should in that.
There is no appetite for slowing down. Everybody wants a 5,000 square foot house. And want their SUVs. And I think at some point in time, whether they want to listen or understand it, or they're going to have to listen. You turn on the news and they're talking about food shortages and fresh water shortages, global warming, and we're not slowing down or curtailing our actions. And these are things that are being proven that are going to affect us.
What we need to do is, what's next? What are the next few steps in the process that we need to be stretching toward? You need to be looking at investing in the near-term improvements to the existing infrastructure. You need to be looking at what should the next level of infrastructure look like and investing in that. And you need to be investing a certain amount in the long-term, the stuff that isn't even on the radar now, the stuff that's way down the road, because those are the solutions that we ultimately need to address the situation.
I think we've got to get rid of all the political agendas and all the posturing that's been going on. the ads that get taken out, the us versus them, it's those silly environmentalists or that silly industry. We need to throw that all away.
If you've got a concern about international development, you're talking about energy. If you've got a concern about health, it's closely related to energy. Transportation, economics, global trade. It doesn't really matter what area of kind of the global system you're involved in. It's tied to energy.
If we don't make a concerted effort to move towards a low-carbon future, the world will just move past us. And we'll become an island that has not dealt with the issue, and it'll become harder for us to be a citizen of the world community.
We have to collaborate and work together across the country, absolutely. Federally and provincially, absolutely. Canada and the US, absolutely. But also in Europe and Germany and Australia and Asia. We have to identify where the expertise and know-how is, figure out how to link it together and come up with the solutions that are going to work.
Well, again, I want to apologize for the frame rate. You can see Canada's Way Forward at rationalmiddle.com, and I tell you, Kaylee and Richard, you guys look kind of good in those weird sort of frame rates. Kind of moving around like a robot a little bit. Well, I want to kind of open this up. Again, I got to tell you, I love this episode just because it goes over so much, and it really frames up Canada as it should be, which is as a potential sort of world leader. I want to kind of take maybe the first question over to you, Tyler. What would you say the current state of energy policy is in Canada these days?
Anxious, discombobulated, rudderless, and looking for a way forward is what I would say. To expand on that, there is...
No, you don't have to expand on it. That was fine.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, no, good. No, please, yeah, expand on it, please.
Canada is a very diverse country with a very diverse energy portfolio, and it kind of sunders along provincial boundaries by which provinces have a lot of jurisdiction and authority over. So we have some provinces that are incredible clean electricity producers through hydropower endowments. We have other provinces that have significant amount of fossil fuel reserves. And it doesn't seem like the federal government is willing to provide any leadership to kind of tie together all of these various provincial, very divergent provincial energy portfolios into a unified framework that prioritizes carbon.
And Richard, could you kind of, and really the overlay on that I'm very interested in is really how, again, one of the things that we learned through making this film is how fractured Canada is as far as its policy is concerned. Can you put that overlay over the different provinces and why people aren't playing nice with each other?
Well, I wouldn't even consider it so much people not playing nice with each other. The provincial system is set up so that each province advocates for the best position for that province relative to the others. So there's always kind of a competitive edge amongst them. So those who've got more carbon emissions are certainly have more of a challenge to address this kind of thing, and those who are extremely strong, as Tyler was saying, are relative to hydropower and nuclear and that sort of thing. The carbon emissions are less of a challenge for them because they're already there, and it's there's the Canada has taken a fairly proactive stance. Their regulations were quite aggressive around coal, but if you sit down and look at the reality of the situation, coal amounted to about 11% of Canada's emissions, whereas down in the States it was about 37%. So Canada's power is far and away dominated by hydro. So it was easy for Canada to be fairly aggressive on coal. It was relatively not terribly painful
for the government to take a fairly aggressive stance there. So that the real challenge is the one that's right up in front of us now, and the next big slice is the oil and gas sector. And so it'll be very interesting to see how the federal government and relatively the provinces address that issue. It's going to be the next big challenge. The thing that's really important to me is there needs to be somehow a price put on carbon that applies across various areas. Otherwise, it's very challenging to figure out how to address this in an economic way. And so it'll be interesting to see what that number comes up to be.
And again, everyone who's out there in our audience, please chime in via Twitter by the hashtag Rational Middle, or message us questions via Facebook. Kaylee, it's interesting. One of the things that Richard brought up is that oil and gas sector that is so strong up in Canada, but you guys are kind of very Dionysian in the sense that you have strong sort of energy portfolios on both sides of the spectrum. When you're sort of going into your world where you sort of deal with this group that is coming up, I mean, how do they sort of handle this idea that Canada is a place with vast amounts of energy on, like I said, different ends of the spectrum?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest issues around Canada's energy diversity is just that it tends to be short-sighted in its policy realms. So we're seeing that a lot of what is happening around energy is really focused on what's going on right now versus the future. And I think that when I talk to young people, there's a concern about what that future looks like for them in terms of economics, environment, social, all of those different elements. So I think that there's different portfolios and there's different levels of knowledge across the country, but mostly we just want to see more progress and more challenging of the status quo.
And so when you look at sort of that status quo and you look at sort of the direction that it's going in right now, I mean, is there a way to sort of link the policy together so that it actually has some efficacy? I mean, what I keep hearing over and over again is this sort of schizophrenia that exists in Canada, say between Alberta and British Columbia and Saskatchewan, and is there a way, like, how can we sort of bridge that gap? And why don't we start with you, Richard?
Yeah, it's the problem isn't just within Canada. The big, first off, on an individual household basis, often I hear, if we increase the cost of energy by putting a price on carbon, the sky would fall. But in fact, if people look at, for the vast majority of Canadians, and I'm not talking about people who are living in an energy poverty scenario, but for the vast majority of Canadians, they spend more on their cell phones and their cable vision and their internet connection than they do on their energy bills. So the argument that the price of energy increasing would be traumatic is not one. When you dig, is not that serious. But when you dig below the surface, the concern is if we raise the cost of doing business in this region, then it's going to drive that industry to another region. So in Canada, the concern is if we move first relative to the U.S., then our industry is going to move to the U.S. Last week, I was in a conference in the U.S. and having the same conversation. And the concern is if California moves too fast, they're going to drive the industry to the next states. The issue is exactly the same everywhere. Nobody wants to move first for fear that they're going to lose industry or lose their economic advantage relative to their next door neighbors. The same thing happens province to province in Canada, but probably the greatest sensitivity is to losing industry internationally, either to the U.S. or abroad.
So Tyler, could you tackle that relationship that Canada and Canadian energy has with the United States? I mean, is that true that there really is sort of a follow-on philosophy that really means that Canada sort of has to wait on the U.S. or they have to work in concert with one another? You might have to unmute your mic, Tyler.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
I think it's true. at least in the history so far, that Canada has waited on the U.S. I don't think it's necessarily true, or I don't think it's implied even that Canada needs to wait on the U.S. It can move forward. But Canada, I mean, even in the history of Canada as a country, we have been pretty much been, as we call it, policy takers from the United States, and that we do follow to a great degree American policy initiatives. So if you look back at the climate change issue and the effort to enact carbon policy, Canada has been following the United States since the Kyoto Protocol, where our leaders decided to, match our targets, or to go a little bit further than the U.S. on their targets once the U.S. had set their targets. Then when Stephen Harper was elected Prime Minister, he said, I think one of his very first statements since after being elected was that Canada was going to pursue a unified or linked cap and trade policy with the United States after it became clear that, this was after Barack Obama was elected. So one of the first statements the Canadian Prime Minister made was that they wanted to have a unified carbon policy. Once the carbon policy efforts in the United States collapsed under Waxman-Markey, coincidentally or not, Canada's ambition and efforts collapsed. And so here we are, waiting for the American giant to move first. Now what's happening is that we've always had a very integrated relationship with the United States on energy exports, and the energy export file is now being hybridized with the carbon policy issue, and we're seeing that in its most clearest flashpoint on the Keystone XL pipeline. And so there's been rumors that Canada has asked the American administration what would it take carbon-wise, carbon policy-wise, to get this pipeline approved. So yes, very much so, we've been reliant on the United States. But I would like to emphasize that we don't need to be reliant on the United States. British Columbia, as mentioned in the video, sought to be a leader and enacted a carbon tax. Now that carbon tax is up to $30. And coincidentally enough, just last week, British Columbia, Washington State, Oregon, and California signed the Pacific Agreement for Climate Action, in large part because of British Columbia and California's leadership. So there's almost a race to the top aspect, that they got all of the Pacific coastal states to sign on to, all of them to price carbon. So I think the story there is that you can lead and expect other jurisdictions to follow along.
And to be clear, that carbon tax in BC is all-encompassing. Is that correct, Tyler?
It's almost all-encompassing. There's a slight, there's not an insignificant amount of emissions that aren't covered, which is what we call process-related emissions and fugitive releases. So British Columbia has a natural gas sector where they don't have to pay for vented emissions, but otherwise every other emission source, about 82% of all emissions, are taxed in British Columbia.
Yeah. And again, you can, we're starting to get questions in, and you can send your questions to hashtag Rational Middle or message them to our Facebook page. Kaylee, when you look at sort of like, your organization, as I understand it, it's global. Is that correct?
Yes.
So, when you look at sort of the way these students are looking at energy and energy policy, and even the energy's way forward. I mean, maybe they don't want to call it policy because that's boring. But I mean, like if they're looking at sort of like the path to a clean energy future, how do a lot of your members look at that relationship between Canada and the United States, and how do they sort of look at sort of the energy future? Do they look at it as those two, like, do they look at it as North America moving together, or do they look at it as Canada leading the way?
I wouldn't say that there's necessarily one overarching view on this, and that's kind of the beauty of what we do, is we encompass many views. But I just do want to say that I think one of the biggest challenges we have in these debates, and that comes up constantly in the things that we do, is that the way that we frame the questions is limiting to the solutions that we can get. So when we are saying, how do we prevent industry from leaving our region, that assumes that economics takes precedent over other things. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily wrong or right, but I'm saying that maybe the question should be more broad, as what do we as Canadians want to achieve, and therefore is there ways to do that without necessarily having to use so much energy or have harsh impacts on the planet. So I think it's really about the way that we frame the questions, and that will dictate the policy that we can achieve.
You know, and we're going to turn it over to our audience, which they've been very active, which is good. One of the things that a lot of people seem to be asking about in sort of a broader way, and some of them a lot more sort of granular, is this idea of nuclear power in Canada. Is there, Richard, is there sort of any plan at all to sort of to engage with nuclear power I mean, I realize that Canada has some of it now, but really sort of to put it out on a broad basis?
To my knowledge, there's no policy in place that would drive toward greater penetration of nuclear power. There's considerable amount of interest in exploring how that might happen, or what that might look like, or what the options in that direction would be, but that's purely an exploration directed kind of conversation. There's no policies in place that I know of that would incentivize expansion of the nuclear fleet beyond what it is now. I'm not sure that that's even on the sort of in the talking points of the government at this point. I think that's one of those things that's likely to be sensitive enough that nobody wants to walk down that path right now. But there's a lot of discussion around, are there opportunities there that we ought to be looking at, especially when we look beyond the early generations of the technology, you know, past not the 40-year-old technology, but what's next on the horizon.
Yeah. And so, Tyler, where do you stand on this idea of sort of implementing nuclear? Just recently in the States, there was a report that was released talking about how renewables can certainly fill some of the needs in the United States for energy, but that nuclear is something that should be brought in and reconsidered. What's your feeling on it?
This is basically the tension point on climate change mitigation between environmentalists and those that are climate hawks. My position on nuclear would be that I agree that Canada doesn't have any concerted policy statements, and it looks like the only new nuclear that Canada will add in the next 10 years will be refurbished reactors at the Pickering power plant in Ontario. There have been kind of wild-eyed proposals to build a nuclear power plant in the oil sands or in Saskatchewan to electrify all of the oil and gas production, therefore significantly reducing their carbon intensity. But then again, you know, oil sands oil is fairly marginal, and the idea of adding an extremely expensive nuclear reactor to power all of that doesn't seem to make economic sense. I guess to answer your question, I'm kind of dancing around it, Gregory. But to answer it, I mean, my feeling is that we should really learn some lessons of the Energy Wende that's going on in Germany, and understand that nuclear power, yes, is low carbon, but it does appear to be very expensive, and it does appear to be locking us into a business model in our utility industry that may not play nicely with expanded intermittent renewables, and that in the short term we need to really nail down what this second generation or third generation of electricity provision and electricity utilities will have to be for a deep carbon reduced electricity system. So I would say I'm interested in nuclear. I certainly acknowledge that it's a very low carbon option, but I just don't know what place it has in an ultra low or radically reduced GHG emission energy system.
And let's go back to you, Richard. A question coming in, and I don't even want to try to pronounce this gentleman's name, but he wants to know what changes need to be made to give renewable energy technologies a stronger foothold across Canada.
I would say there are two parts to that. One of the big challenges with renewables is the intermittency issue, and up to a point that can be addressed by putting on more peaking power, natural gas-fired peaking power generators, but really to hit the levels of penetration that are ultimately targeted. And I expect Tyler would agree with me on this, that the key issue here is going to be energy storage technologies on a utility scale, and we just don't have those technologies nailed down yet at an economic price point that would be acceptable at this point. So to me, the biggest breakthrough would be if we can address the energy storage side to deal with the intermittency on renewables. That would make a quantum leap in the level of penetration potential for renewables.
And Kaylee, you look like you're just chomping at the bit to jump in on this one.
Yeah, I would just say that there's also a big elephant in the room, that there isn't a fair playing field when it comes to different technologies. So there are a lot of subsidies on both sides, but fossil fuels are still being subsidized, which is an interesting thing given how profitable they are. So I think that we also have to look at the constraints that we create and how that will drive innovation. So constraints often create innovation, but not if they're batted against a certain technology.
Yeah. And we got about 2 minutes, and I've got 2 questions, and I'll keep looking to see if there's just a bombshell that comes over on the right nav. But so why is it important that Canada get their energy policy right? Why don't we start with you, Tyler?
Well, traditionally, the energy sector is an incredibly important economic sector of Canada. And I guess because we only have 2 minutes, I'll keep this very short. But we risk investing a lot in the 20th century's energy source, where we have renewable and other energy options. Canada's renewable energy resource is virtually unparalleled in the world. We are a renewable energy superpower, and we are, in my opinion, focusing on what seems to be the 20th century's energy source for a world that I think will start walking away from a lot of carbon-intensive fuels.
Yeah, and you know, that two minutes, by the way, it's a soft 2 minutes, Tyler. So I love hearing you talk. So if you have more to say, please jump in.
I'll let others. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Richard, how do you tackle that?
Well, I would say the big issue is Canada has a tremendous fossil fuel, especially oil and gas, kind of resource there that if we have the potential to take a leadership role around the carbon emissions associated with it, the unintended consequences associated with that sector, through carbon capture and sequestration or whatever other technologies. We have the ability to step in and take a significant leadership role. It won't be free. It will cost money, and it will take a high level of commitment to make this happen. It can happen. The problem is, as Tyler kind of alludes to, if we don't take that leadership position, then we leave ourselves open to the other solution, which is turn the taps off, where we start getting shut out of markets, and we lose the value of that resource. So we either have to learn how to deal with and address the unintended consequences, the side effects of the carbon emissions and the venting and other issues associated with greenhouse gases associated with that industry, and show ourselves to be responsible leaders in that area, or we're going to wind up finding we can't get access to markets because we've tried to take a shortcut on it. That commitment is going to have to be there.
So, Kaylee, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that the reason this is so important for Canada is because, well, I believe as a Canadian, we have a responsibility to be a leader on these types of things because we absolutely have the opportunity and resources to be one. We're literally the most educated population on the planet, and we are a developed nation, and so I think if we can't do it, no one can, so we really need to push the envelope and try and be leaders and not just followers.
That's great. I do, and you actually led me into kind of what that last question, those last thoughts are going to be. I do want to tell you that there is a group of students out there that just tweeted out that policy is not boring. So you guys have made policy interesting. Congratulations. That's fantastic news. So if everything goes well, what does the energy future look like in Canada?
I can jump in on this just quickly. I think there's general convergence on a low emissions future if that's what we want to pursue, in that we're going to move to significant amount of electrification of our energy end uses. So electrification for transport, heating, mechanical energy, all of that. We're going to move to electricity as an energy currency, and then we're going to have to decarbonize the upstream energy generation in Canada. And luckily, we are way ahead of the curve on that. We do have a significant amount of renewable energy resources already developed. And then the second part is drastically increasing the energy efficiency of our entire energy system by an order of 35 to 40%. 20%. So I think that's what the low carbon energy future looks like, or those are two major pillars of it.
Richard?
Yeah, in fact, I agree with Tyler, but the question is, future is an interesting word because you have to kind of pick a time frame, because we have to move towards a low carbon energy future. We actually have to reach a zero carbon emissions or zero net carbon emissions future just to stop increasing the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. The real challenge is going to be, I believe that we will not hit that zero carbon emissions future before we have dramatically increased the CO2 emissions. So I think the real point that we have to look at, and it may be late in this century or even early the next, but ultimately we're going to have to get to a net negative emissions future, which is I know it's a challenge beyond what people normally talk about, but it isn't good enough to by 2075 get to a net zero emissions level. We have to set our level, our ambitions much higher than that.
And Kelly, you want to take us home?
Yeah, I think that I'm going to step back and be a little bit more philosophical and just say that I think part of this entire equation is seeing energy as a means to an end versus an end in itself. And energy enables us as human beings to do certain things that we need, or keep us warm, make us be able to transport ourselves, help us communicate with each other, all those different pieces. So I think that we need to start thinking about what we as human beings actually value, and push for policies that will enable that versus just trying to get more energy or trying to figure out what that perfect supply mix is. It's really about what does it mean to individuals and human beings.
Kelly, that was great, and I got to tell you, this was phenomenal. You guys all did a beautiful job. You can't hear it, but there is applause going all over Canada right now for you guys because you guys were awesome. So, Tyler, Richard, Kaylee, I cannot thank you enough for doing this. Again, if you want to see the films, it is at rationalmiddle.com. Again, we hope to do a lot more of these. Thank you again to our experts, and we're out.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.